Good morning and welcome to Georgetown University. I'm Chester Gillis. I'm the Dean of the College at Georgetown. This major international conference celebrates the inauguration of the Jacques Rossi Memorial Gulag Research Fund, which has been made possible thanks to the generous gift of French-Swiss-born Elizabeth Salina Amarini, who along with her husband, Gianluca Salina Amarini, honor us with their presence today. A lawyer by profession, Elizabeth held a position at the S.G. Warburg Bank in London prior to serving from 1987 until 1998 as the director of the Société Générale de Surveillance, a public company founded by her Russian-born grandfather, Jacques Salmanowitz, who during World War II was actively involved in helping victims of Nazi atrocities. An avid student of Gulag studies, Elizabeth was inspired to launch this initiative following her reading of Georgetown professor and our opening speaker, Michèle Sarde's acclaimed book, written in collaboration with Polish-French Gulag survivor Jacques Rossi, a collaboration that began during the years between 1979 and 1995, when Georgetown provided refuge and hospitality to Rossi as a visiting scholar. A fortuitous subsequent meeting in Paris between Michèle and Elizabeth, who along with her husband Gianluca already had a deep affection for Georgetown thanks to their son Vincenzo's experience as an undergraduate here, spurred on Elizabeth's pursuit of the quest to make Georgetown University the site of a renewal of Gulag studies in honor of the memory of Jacques Rossi. In future years following this inaugural conference, Elizabeth's ongoing generous support will enable gifted students at both the undergraduate and graduate levels to undertake new research on any aspect of the Soviet Gulag. This conference brings together scholars from Russia, Europe, and North America at a particularly opportune time when major new advances are being made in the understanding of the Gulag network of forced labor camps and Stalinist repression. Historians, both Russian and Western, for many decades did not have archival sources to study the Gulag. To this day, although much is known, the Gulag has not been commemorated or confronted in a manner commensurate to the scale of the human and social catastrophe, either in the former Soviet space, the public mind, or even in the world of scholarship. Even now, there are voices in Russia minimizing or justifying the Gulag. This makes this gathering especially important. Georgetown is a particularly appropriate place for a project bearing the name of Jacques Rossi. Rossi was arrested in the USSR in 1937. While he was a visiting scholar here, he completed the testimony of his years of incarceration in his Gulag Handbook, a work that is still respected and used today. The Jacques Rossi Fund enhances Georgetown's already strong presence in the field of Russian studies. The first undergraduate and graduate student winners of the student research competition will be announced at the end of today's events. Today's lectures and discussions will be followed by 2 days of scholarly papers, which will result in a special issue published by the journal Kritika, Explorations in Russian History, which is housed here at Georgetown, and a subsequent book in the Kritika Historical Studies series. A conference such as this one requires an academic leader to make it happen. Georgetown is fortunate to have that leader in Michael David Fox, who has been the visionary and the driving force to bring international scholars together here today. He has worked diligently for the last year to ensure a successful conference, for which I thank him. We all owe him a debt of gratitude, and I think a round of applause. Georgetown is proud to host this gathering. We hope that you enjoy our hospitality and that you benefit from your conversations during this conference, and that others will benefit from your publications. Thank you for being here.
Good morning. As professor and interim chair of the Georgetown French Department, I would like to add my welcome to this opening day's events for the International Conference on the Soviet Gulag hosted by our university. Before I introduce our first speaker, Michèle Sarde, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Dean Gillis for his enthusiastic support of the initiative to make Georgetown a center for Gulag studies. Also, my admiration and congratulations to Michael David Fox for his superb planning and coordination of this conference and of the ongoing Gulag Scholarship Program. And finally, my gratitude to Elizabeth Selina Amorini for her indefatigable efforts to keep the memory of Jacques Rossi alive through her passionate vision and her sponsorship of the Jacques Rossi Memorial Gulag Fund. And now it is both a great privilege and honor for me to introduce this morning's opening speaker, Michèle Sarde, whose 2002 book, Jacques le Français pour Mémoire du Gulag, as Dean Gillis has mentioned, was a catalyst for Elizabeth Selina Amorini's initiative that we celebrate today, and who for 30 years was our distinguished and cherished colleague in the French department at Georgetown University before being named Professor Emerita in 2001, then turning to devote herself full-time to the literary and scholarly pursuits she has balanced throughout a remarkable career that has seen the publication of 14 authored or edited books. Indeed, alongside her eminent scholarly and pedagogical contributions to Georgetown and to the American Academy, Michèle Sarde has earned an international reputation as an award-winning literary and cultural critic, novelist, essayist, and biographer, and as a respected public intellectual on both sides of the Atlantic. First, a pioneering figure in the field of French women's studies with her literary and biographical studies of Colette and Marguerite Yourcenar, her groundbreaking 1984 work, Regard sur les Françaises, and its acclaimed 2007 sequel, De l'alcôve à la reine, Nouveau regard sur les Françaises, Michèle Sarde's interests have progressively turned to the study of culture in its sociological and historical dimensions. The book she will be discussing today, Jacques le Français, is in the genre of biography she has practiced with women writers, but this time is centered on a witness to a grave historical phenomenon who himself collaborated with her on the telling of his story. Following in this biographical and socio-historical trajectory, Michèle Sarde is currently completing a memoir tracing the history of her Judeo-Iberian families from their expulsion from Spain up to the Holocaust, a work scheduled to appear in France at Éditions Julliard in 2014. In all her writings, Michèle Sarde continues to explore, with passionate and compassionate insight, the realities of our state as gendered beings and the deeper core of our common humanity in the context of both personal, and global vicissitudes. The title, most fittingly, of her address today is Jacques Rossi, An Education in the Gulag. Please join me now in offering a warm and grateful welcome back to Georgetown for Michèle Sarde.
Debbie, my dear friend, I'm so happy to be back at Georgetown, where I spent many wonderful years teaching. And I would like to thank the people who made this return visit possible. Dean Chester Gillis and Professor Michael David Fox, who organized this important conference. Elizabeth Salina Armorini's generosity, and Professor Debbie Lesko-Baker's determination made the dream of this Jacques Rossi Gulag Research Fund come through. I would like to express our deep gratitude to them and thank as well the Department of French, along with the McCarthy Endowment Fund, for their support. Special thanks to my colleague and friend, Anne-Marie Munzberg-Engel. Distinguished participants in the conference, dear colleagues, dear students, dear friends, in the spirit of the Jacques Rossi Fund, I will address this lecture to the future Gulag researchers, that is, our own students, in order to encourage them to work in this field. Jacques Rossi would have liked the idea of passing the torch to young generations. But who was Jacques Rossi? He survived 20 years in transit, high security, and central prisons, as well as in camps for re-education through labor. The term Gulag, which describes the entire Soviet penitentiary system, encompasses both the prisons and places of exile in one single administration, roughly the size of a country. Jacques Rossi devoted the rest of his life to a massive effort of research into the Gulag system, where he had spent his youth. For you, Georgetown's 21st century students, if you decide to do research on the Gulag, you will not be required to live in one of the camps or prisons. Count yourselves lucky. I would like to tell you how I met this great man who witnessed the Gulag at first hand and recorded it for posterity. One day, he simply knocked at the door of my office, ICC 419. It was in the fall of 1985. The door opened to reveal an unexpected visitor. He said his name was Jacques Rossi, a man of about 75. He was dreadfully sorry to disturb me, he said. Would it be possible to teach some French classes in our department, he asked. He was coming at the suggestion of Aurélia Roman, my colleague originally from Romania, who still teaches at Georgetown and is here. I asked what qualifications he had, and he gave me his CV. Under the heading Education, this is what I read. Fine Arts graduate, Berlin Academia and École des Beaux-Arts, Paris, 1929 to 1934. Oriental Civilizations, Sorbonne and École des Langues Orientales, Paris, 1929 to 1936. And then, to my great surprise, Survival Studies, Gulag Archipelago, 1937 to 1957. Survival Studies. To my knowledge, the subject had never been included in any university program. However, this man, claiming to be its first graduate, had first-hand knowledge of this very specialized area. He had survived almost 20 years in one of the most horrific concentration camp systems of the 20th century, a century of darkness that is now behind us. Even so, he did not see himself as a victim, but rather as someone who was himself responsible. Yes, fully responsible for what happened to him. Why? Because as a young man, he had been a committed communist, ready to die for a cause that he then believed was just. For him, the Gulag did not represent an unfair punishment, but a place of instruction. As he put it, he had been punished for his sins. He had believed in a fantasy, a utopia, and it took all those years of captivity for him to understand the myth of utopia, to understand his error, to strip it down, extract the universal truth, and draw the conclusions. First, I wanted to know who he was, to hear the story of his life. Over time, he gave me various versions of his account. I'm summarizing here the most plausible ones. Jacques Rossi was born in 1909 in Breslau, a town that was German at the time. It is now Wrocław in Poland. His father was Polish and his mother French. His rich family came from high society. When he was a little boy, his mother refused to send him to school as she thought him too frail. After Poland's independence in 1920, his father decided to move to Poland with his family. One day, while the boy was walking on the grounds of the family estate with his English governess, an old peasant woman came up to him and kissed his hand. He was utterly revolted by this incident. It was this spectacle of the injustice of the ruling class in Polish society of that time that, he said, led him to follow the path of communism and militancy. At the age of 17, he joined the underground Polish Communist Party. He was arrested for distributing pamphlets calling upon young soldiers to revolt. When he was freed after 6 months, he was sent to Berlin by his party and entered the service of Comintern. And so he became a secret agent. Undercover and using false names, Jacques Rossi studied languages and fine arts in Paris, Berlin, Cambridge, and Moscow. However, Jacques was no James Bond. I was only an instrument, but one that was proud to serve the great cause of social justice, he explained. He stressed that he was only an insignificant messenger with no responsibility in the larger institution. Above all, he emphasized his communist convictions, bordering on fanaticism. He stated that if someone had told him that it served the cause for him to jump off the Eiffel Tower, he would have done so without a second thought. In 1937, he was sent to Spain, which was at the time in the middle of the Civil War. His mission on Franco's territory was to liaise with the Spanish Republicans. A few weeks later, he was called to what was known as the village, that is Moscow. Despite the fact that all of the Western press was by that time reporting Stalin's great purges, he immediately answered the call. Rossi was becoming a victim of what is known as the Great Terror. In Moscow, he was asked to report to his headquarters. From there, he was sent directly to Lubyanka prison. Later, he was transferred to Butyrka, the Moscow remand center, for 16 months. During that time, he was tortured in order for him to provide the reasons for his own arrest. After all, he had been arrested for nothing. No trial, no sentence. Much later, he was informed of the verdict, a sentence of 8 years in a labor camp for re-education in accordance with Article 58, paragraph 6. In other words, he was accused of espionage. In his case, this was supposed to be on behalf of France and Poland because he was Franco-Polish and spoke both languages. From there, we are now in 1939, Rossi was taken in a Stolypin rail car to an unknown destination, which turned out to be the Arctic, beyond Siberia, beyond the polar circle. After passing through countless transit prisons, he ended up in Krasnoyarsk transit camp on the Yenisei River. There, a massive barge transported thousands of zeks, that is prisoners, down the river, across the taiga, and then the tundra, toward the port of Dudinka, which was part of the Norilsk camp. Rossi's sentence was to have ended in 1945, but he was not released until April 15, 1947. His release was conditional. Thus, he was not allowed to leave Norilsk. During this time, new evidence was fabricated against him, and he was arrested again in March 1949. This time, he was sentenced to 25 years and incarcerated first in the remand prison of Norilsk and then in Krasnoyarsk, Irkutsk, and Alexandrovsk. That is where he was in 1954, when Stalin died, when the process of de-Stalinization and the release of political prisoners began. In 1956, he returned from there via the various transit prisons toward Moscow and ended up in his final prison, the central prison of Vladimir, close to the capital. But release from the little Gulag did not bring freedom in the great Gulag, that is the Soviet Union. Rossi was given a compulsory order of residence in Samarkand, in Central Asia, and was only allowed to leave the Soviet Union for Communist Poland 5 years later, in February 1961. These facts that make up the fabric of Jacques' life story, we reconstructed together in the eve of his life. By then, he was 90 years old. After making several attempts to write his autobiography in collaboration with various journalists and historians, he ended up coming to me with the following suggestion. Let's do the book together. You are a novelist. so you can make it into a novel. A novel. The difference between a novel and a testimony is that in fiction, you can invent, imagine, and elude. Only later did I understand the meaning of his desire to turn his life into a novel by his reluctance to speak directly of certain things, and his habit of secrecy, his addiction to secrecy. Secrecy may become a second nature. In Paris, at the beginning of the 21st century, Jacques Rossi still wrote his Parisian address book in secret code. Jacques feared, above all, that any indiscretion could harm friends who were still alive. I, on the other hand, was demanding absolute transparency. His first reflex was therefore to refuse, to rebel, to treat me as an interrogating officer, in other words, as a torturer. And then, suddenly, he would reveal things that in turn shed light on other things. For me, it was like detective work. Testimony, while it is always reconstructed to a greater or lesser degree, has to meet standards of accuracy, of veracity, of truth. This is what we discovered together while writing the book. Rossi's experience was too powerful, too intense, and above all, too universal to be transformed into the stuff of a novel. He had no right to lie, even by omission. He had a duty to bear witness on behalf of the millions of companions who disappeared in the Gulag. After all, Rossi's deep inner motivation to tell his story, regardless of me or any other person, was precisely that, to bear witness and to tell the whole truth, at least the whole of his truth, of an experience that was at once exceptional and sadly representative. To tell the truth of his experience was also to speak on behalf of his dead comrades, an enormous responsibility. A witness, especially when he or she has had to wait a long time before speaking, engages in a work of memory rather than of history. Certainly, Rossi's memory was prodigious. He exercised it like a muscle, not only when he was a secret agent, but also when he was in the Gulag, where nothing could be written down and kept. On the way to the camps, he remembered Solzhenitsyn's lesson, quote, "Let your memory be your travel bag. Use your memory, use your memory. If it is those bitter seeds alone which might sprout and grow someday," unquote. What distinguishes a witness from a historian, first and foremost, is his subjectivity. It is he who determines, when recounting the past, which parts to delete and which to retain. Above all, the witness has a point of view on his story, while the historian is supposed not to have a stance. Rossi's subjectivity was based on two features that define him in relation to the universe of the Gulag. On the one hand, he had been a committed communist who religiously believed in the cause of the proletariat and social justice. On the other hand, in this Soviet concentration camp system, inherited from the Tsarist House of the Dead, that cultivated man of Franco-Polish origin was a foreigner. This ardent communist was not a Soviet by culture. even though he spoke Russian perfectly. In a way, therefore, he looked at the Soviet concentration camp system with fresh eyes. He was perhaps more sensitive than the Russians to the absurdity of the system. For example, he recognized that he seldom encountered pure sadism among the individuals implementing the system, such as guards, officers, or even the secret police torturers. In communist Russia, he said, it was not necessarily man, but the system that was criminal, unquote. If he was freezing to death in his cell, it was not because the guards were cruel, but because the rules forbade them to give him his undershirt. Quite simply, these men were obeying orders that would probably turn them as well into victims of the same system in the not too distant future. Being a foreigner also helped Rossi, as his fellow prisoners trusted him more than they would have trusted another Soviet. I quote him, "Many of my Soviet companions felt the need to unburden themselves of their experiences. I don't know why, but they seemed to believe that as a Frenchman, I would perhaps have the good fortune to get out one day," unquote. Their trust saved his life on more than one occasion, and it also helped his fellow prisoners to confide on him, which would later facilitate the work of passing on the story. Several of these confessions appear in fiction in his short collection of stories and published in English called Quelle était belle cette utopie? How beautiful was that utopia? This position on the margins, which allowed him to be both inside and outside the system, was strengthened by another of Rossi's personality traits, a sense of humor that was black and biting, which enabled him to rise above the most dramatic situations through laughter and to allow the untellable to be told. Here is an example. When Rossi was a Comintern agent, he had to carry secret documents on a cruise ship in the Mediterranean with a fake Swedish passport. On boarding the ship, he learned that there was another Swede on board. He was seized with panic at the idea that he would be unmasked by a real Swede. And so he pretended to be sick and missed out on the whole of this beautiful voyage. This story he told Rudy, a prisoner who, between two interrogations, has just arrived in his miserable cell. He did so in order to distract his prison mate from the torture he had just undergone. Rudy, appalled, like Rossi, listened to the story and smiled. The other Swede? That was me. Another advantage for this particular Zek was that he had been a scholar of fine arts and languages. For this gifted linguist, who spoke more than 10 languages, studying the language spoken in the Gulag became a springboard to constructing a work that is not just a work of memory, but also a work of history. History is distinguished from memory by its objective, or at least its intersubjective nature. And this is the case here. It is in the name of thousands of witnesses that Rossi speaks. And it is no longer a matter of one individual point of view on the Gulag. It is an academic type of research based on primary sources as well as references to archives, documents, and statistics. This is what allows for as accurate a reconstruction as possible of the reality of the Gulag. Jacques Rossi did not content himself with passing on the memory of a first-hand witness. He wanted to leave behind a legitimate historical record by constructing his monumental handbook. What I want to make clear is that Rossi's originality lies not just in his testimony or that of his fellow prisoners. After all, there have been so many testimonies. His originality is that he became the historian of his own history by giving it a universal dimension. For 70 years, he writes, the Gulag was used as a secret laboratory for the Soviet regime. That is why knowledge of the Gulag is fundamental to the study of the communist totalitarian regime. Unfortunately, no Sovietologist ever did the apprenticeship there, unquote. How did this particular apprentice, this simple Zek, become a Sovietologist? As we have seen, for years and years, Rossi listened to fellow prisoners who confided in him. They were very diverse. They included dekulakized peasants, major thugs, good patriotic communists who did not renounce their convictions, true enemies of the people, and former torturers who one evening became victims of the same system. All these Soviets spoke to him in their individual jargon, the Gulag slang, a specific language born of a specific culture. Rossi was multilingual and passionate about languages. He had a remarkable memory, which he used during his time as an undercover communist. That same memory would retain thousands of Gulag expressions that were no part of the Russian language proper. It was a composite language consisting of the accumulation and sedimentation of several linguistic strata, the slang of the ordinary prisoners, the legal language of the penitentiary administration, the specific vocabulary of the political prisoners, and words from pre-revolutionary Russian penal colonies. This real language, with its acronyms and neologisms that included a material and human reality, was in counterpoint to the wooden official language that sought to mask this same reality. He used it to describe and indeed explain the concentration camp universe from which it sprang. There are words and there are testimonies. He gathered both and began his first approach to the Gulag that he took for what it was, in words of Nicolas Werth, an extraordinary sociological laboratory, a place of social and political experimentation where all was laid bare, both the regime and the human material, unquote. The first step was therefore to assemble the facts. But when Rossi undertook this Dantean task, he was no quiet researcher in the Library of Congress. He was a Zek who had been held in the Gulag for years on end, who had not been allowed to take any notes, and who was subjected to regular searches, even in the most intimate places. Nevertheless, he managed to write and keep records. He also made sketches of what he saw, which were confiscated, and awaits some curious young researcher in the archives of the secret police. How did he manage this? He refused to reveal it to me, to avoid betraying a secret that could be of use against other detainees. The second step was to take place in communist Poland after Rossi had left the Gulag and had started, thanks to his still fresh memories and his secret records, full of recollections, to set up a gigantic file. But here too, he was not living in a country with freedom of expression, and so to transfer his work to the West, he had to use the diplomatic bag of the French embassy where he had some contacts. The third step is of particular interest to you and to me. It took place right here at Georgetown University, the University of Jan Karski, our university. Upon leaving Poland, Rossi set off for the United States at the invitation of a former Polish student, and in Washington, he met Father Bradley, dean of the college, who invited him to take advantage of the freedom of expression and make use of the library at Georgetown. So it is here that he completed his work on primary sources, which he gathered through patient, detailed, encyclopedic research, and wrote a book on all aspects of the Soviet concentration camp system. The result is, first of all, a fascinating linguistic investigation of an unknown idiom, the language of the Gulag, several thousand entries in the original Russian edition published in London in 1987. The exemplary erudition of the handbook covers all the dimensions of the Gulag culture, if I can use that word: geographical, material, sociological, economic, and legal dimensions at once. In this manner, the subjective witness gave way to the intersubjective historian and drew closer to the challenging goal of objectivity. Usually, witnesses do not much like historians, who have not themselves suffered the situations they describe and analyze. Historians, for their part, mistrust witnesses, suspicious of their good faith, accuracy, and veracity. Rossi managed to reconcile the two. He spent 24 years of his life listening, recording, and conceiving his project. Then he applied himself to editing the records, drawing up the files, checking and confirming his work by searching through archives, documents, studies, and works by other people. Memory and history are to complement and benefit each other, but if they do so, the past must not be cultivated for itself, but must above all be used to serve. This is how Jacques Rossi saw it. He wanted to place his experience at the service of education with a view to warning the world. His individual testimony as a Zek crushed by an oppressive system was to be placed at the service of a universal cause. To conclude, some questions. In this mass slaughterhouse, what became of the individual? What happened to the human being? What about forgiveness and the spirit of vengeance? How can a human being protect his soul in this gigantic crushing machine of degradation and destruction? How can he or she survive 24 years of captivity? This is where individual testimony is of greatest value. And it is a mark of the greatness of the existential choice of Jacques Rossi, the former Zek, that in the final analysis, he concluded that he had no personal resentment against these men, even the criminals who abused him in the Norilsk camp, even the policemen who tortured him in Butyrka prison, even the false companions who betrayed him and who helped to have him sentenced for a second time. Jacques told me, quote, "The scale of the evil obliterates any thought of vengeance. The more the desire for revenge, which only impedes the search for truth, is reduced to a pitiful settling of personal scores, the more noble is the task of struggling to avoid repeating the nightmare," unquote. Rossi wanted this awful experience, endured by millions of men and women, to serve as a lesson. Will it prevent new blindness, new forms of fanaticism? The question remains open. Survival is at the heart of the problems surrounding the concentration camp system. Quote, "Anyone who has survived in these circumstances will always have at the bottom of his heart the lingering sensation that this life is somehow shameful and shaming," says Andrei Sinyavsky. Why am I not dead? That is the ultimate question. And in reality, why am I still alive while all the others have died? Unquote. Why didn't you die? When I asked this question over and over again, Jacques replied wearily, as if he were always being asked to explain the unexplainable. "I had a strong constitution. I didn't get beaten up too much. I had no family and so no weak point. I was inured to the harsh ways of underground existence. I was infinitely curious about other people, and I wanted to make sense of what was happening to us. And I had read, I had studied. In short, I was lucky. I was not forced to commit dirty tricks. I met a few human beings. In the end, it was a matter of resilience, and I had friends," unquote. Each of these good reasons is worthy of close inspection and affects us all, as they touch upon the limits of human capacity to endure. I would add another good reason, another trait that characterized Rossi, namely his spirit of resistance. It was immense. For example, he underwent 3 hunger strikes while he was in the Gulag. How can you go on hunger strike in a world where you are constantly deprived of food? Indeed, as with many other questions, Jacques could never really provide a final answer. And that is why, however significant his work of memory and history, however important his testimony and his attempts to prevent such horrors being repeated, it calls for further research so that the why and how of totalitarian systems and their attendant crimes against humanity can be better understood and explained. There is always a certain amount of subjectivity in research, however academic and objective it may be. The reason why the impact of my first meeting with Jacques Rossi was so strong is that I myself am the granddaughter of people deported to the Nazi camps. Jacques Rossi may have come back from the Gulag, but my grandfather never returned from Auschwitz. Indeed, Rossi had some blind spots. For him, nothing was worse than the Gulag, and he believed that the Holocaust had been given too much media coverage in comparison with the silence that surrounded and still surrounds the memory of the Gulag. He did not deny that in the Nazi camps, death was an end in itself, while in the Soviet concentration camps, it was life that had no value. However, he showed that the Nazi concentration camp system had been inspired by the Soviet one, which had preceded it both in time and organization. He highlighted the fact that communism turned on its own people, while the Nazis did not exterminate other Nazis. As for me, he said, if I had not been a communist, I would never have been in the Gulag. In fact, I went there of my own free will. But he did not take into account the issue of the children, or the gas chambers, or the final solution, and could only offer a unique, subjective, personal point of view on these terrible matters. However immense a testimony, a work of memory, or a work of history, it also has its limits. These inevitable boundaries can be crossed by other individuals, the new experts, like the participants in this conference. They can be enriched with the help of new archives and previously unpublished discoveries. And so it is up to you, students, to continue the work to ensure through description, analysis, and further interpretation of these horrendous systems that they are not reproduced. Contrary to Shalamov, for whom the camp is definitely a school against life, for Jacques Rossi, the Gulag was a place of study, research, and reflection, in sum, a school of truth, and at the same time, a laboratory and a university. And he invited us to follow in his footsteps, to fill in the gaps in his information, to research even further. Now, new technologies have been developed, certain archives have been opened, time and distance make it possible to discover and disseminate truth that until just a short time ago were too uncomfortable to be discussed openly. Jacques Rossi may have disappeared physically 10 years ago, but his spirit remains in this very place where I met him, where he wrote the Gulag Handbook. Through me, he is asking other researchers to continue the work that he sought to achieve until his dying breath. He would encourage us, above all, to denounce, to elucidate those systems that massacred so many people in the darkest days of the past century and still exist today. This task is important for democracy. It is important for human rights. It's important for the future of humanity. It is a just cause. Thank you.
I'm Michael David Fox from the History Department and the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown. It was a wonderful inauguration to this conference to have Michèle Sarde speak about Jacques Rossi, because it provides a bridge from his experience here and his work to the project that bears his name. I just want to say a few words of appreciation to the people who have made this conference possible. Several have mentioned Elizabeth Salina Amarini and who sponsored and whose generous gift made possible the Jacques Rossi Memorial Gulag Research Fund. And we're very happy to have her and her husband, Gianluca Selina Amarini, here with us. But I also want to say a word to the other institutions that have sponsored this, including the Dean of the College of Georgetown, the Dean's Office of the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, the Department of French here at Georgetown, and its interim chair, Debbie Lesko-Baker, and the journal Critica, Explorations in Russian Eurasian History, the Special Projects Fund, of which also contributed, and I want to acknowledge here my co-editor and co-organizer, Peter Holquist of the University of Pennsylvania, and last but not least, the person who really did the heavy lifting in organizing the conference, Kathleen Gallagher of the History Department. So if we could just thank everyone who's responsible for this. Thank you.